The breakthrough at Sedan in May 1940 is remembered as the perfect demonstration of Blitzkrieg German panzers smashing through French defences with mechanical precision, crossing the Meuse River, through brilliant planning and superior tactics, exploiting into France with unstoppable momentum. It's the iconic image of Wehrmacht invincibility, the moment that proved German military superiority and modern warfare doctrine. The reality was completely different. Sedan wasn't precision, it was chaos. It wasn't planned perfection, it was desperate improvisation. German forces were disorganized. Commanders were arguing crucial units, were stuck in traffic jams that stretched for miles. French defences weren't overwhelmed by superiority. They collapsed through confusion, panic, and catastrophic command failures. The crossing succeeded partly through German boldness, but mostly through French mistakes and sheer luck that German commanders couldn't believe when it happened. The myth of Sedan as a masterpiece of military planning was created after the war by German generals, writing memoirs by historians, looking for explanations of France's collapse, and by military theorists who wanted Blitzkrieg to be a coherent doctrine rather than aggressive improvisation that happened to work. This is the story of what really happened at Sedan: the traffic jams and confusion, the arguments between commanders, the moments when everything nearly fell apart, the luck that made success possible, and how post-war propaganda transformed messy reality into clean mythology. Sedan wasn't the triumph of planning. It was the triumph of chaos managed just barely well enough to exploit enemy chaos that was worse. The German plan for invading France in 1940 went through multiple iterations before settling on what became known as the Manstein Plan, named after General Erich von Manstein, who advocated for shifting the main attack axis from Belgium to the Ardennes forest. The original German plan, Case Yellow, was conventional attack through Belgium, as Germany had done in World War I with the main effort in the north. This plan was compromised when a German officer carrying planning documents crashed his aircraft in Belgium in January 1940, forcing revision. Manstein proposed something radical: attack through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River near Sedan, and drive west toward the English Channel, cutting Allied armies in half. German high command was sceptical. The Ardennes was considered difficult terrain for armour. The Meuse River crossing would be vulnerable. The concept relied on achieving breakthrough in narrow sector where French defences could concentrate. But the alternative plans offered little chance of decisive victory, and Hitler liked bold plans. Manstein's concept was adopted, though many senior commanders remained doubtful. What emerged was not coherent doctrine, but gamble, concentrate armour. In narrow corridor bet, everything on achieving surprise and breakthrough, improvise exploitation once through French lines. It was audacious, possibly insane, and definitely not the careful planning implied by post-war narratives. The advance through the Ardennes was supposed to be rapid movement through difficult terrain, but reality was massive traffic jam. 7 Panzer divisions and supporting infantry divisions funneled through narrow roads designed for local traffic, not military operations. The columns stretched for miles. Tanks, trucks, artillery, support vehicles all crawling forward at walking pace, frequently stopping completely when traffic bottlenecks developed. German commanders worried constantly about Allied air attacks on these columns. A single squadron of bombers could have created catastrophe, destroying vehicles and blocking roads, turning the advance into disaster. But Allied air reconnaissance failed to identify the massive concentration, and French command didn't believe intelligence reports suggesting large German forces were moving through the Ardennes. The French High Command considered the Ardennes impassable for armour, ironically the same assumption German commanders had worried about, and deployed weak forces to defend that sector. This was French strategic error that made German operational risk workable, but German forces didn't know they'd gotten lucky until they reached the Meuse and encountered minimal resistance. The Meuse River crossing at Sedan was supposed to happen after artillery and air support softened French defences, but timing broke down immediately. Different German units arrived at the river on different schedules. Some found crossing points lightly defended and started crossing immediately. Others faced heavy fire from French bunkers and had to wait for support that didn't arrive on schedule. Luftwaffe air support was supposed to be coordinated with ground attacks, but communication failures meant bombers arrived at wrong times, hit wrong targets, or didn't arrive at all. German artillery was still in traffic jams behind the infantry. Some German units crossed the river in rubber rafts under fire, improvising tactics because planned equipment wasn't available. French defenders fired on the crossing attempts, inflicting casualties, destroying rafts, temporarily stopping advances. At multiple points during the crossing, German commanders thought the operation was failing and prepared to abort. What saved the operation was not German planning, but French command dysfunction. French units on the far bank received contradictory orders. Artillery support was inadequate. Reinforcements were sent to wrong locations. German forces exploited French confusion faster than French forces could exploit German disorganization. General Heinz Guderian, commanding 19th Panzer Corps, was the most aggressive German commander at Sedan and took risks that horrified his superiors. Guderian believed in rapid exploitation, get across the river, establish bridgehead, push forward immediately without waiting for flanks to be secured or logistics to catch up. His philosophy was that speed created its own security by keeping enemies off balance. This worked at Sedan, but was incredibly risky. Guderian's forces established bridgehead on May 13th, then immediately began expanding it, attacking French positions before French could organize counterattacks. By May 14th, German armor was breaking out of the bridgehead and driving west. Guderian wanted to exploit immediately toward the coast. His superior general, Ewald von Kleist, ordered him to halt and consolidate because the bridgehead was vulnerable to French counterattack from north and south. Guderian ignored the order, claiming radio problems prevented him from receiving it. This insubordination could have resulted in court-martial, but instead resulted in breakthrough, because French counterattacks never materialized effectively. Guderian's bet that French were too disorganized to counterattack was proven correct. But he didn't know that when he made the decision, he was gambling with his entire corps. French response to Sedan was paralyzed by command structure and doctrine that couldn't process the speed of events. French military doctrine in 1940 was defensive and methodical, establish strong points, conduct counter-attacks with prepared forces, fight battles of attrition where French numerical superiority would prevail. This doctrine assumed time to position forces, time to coordinate attacks, time to bring reserves forward. German breakthrough at Sedan gave French forces no time. By the time French command identified breakthrough was happening, an organized response German forces had already exploited beyond reach. French reserves existed, armor divisions, infantry divisions, artillery, but couldn't be positioned fast enough because French command operated on timetable measured in days, while German exploitation was measured in hours. The famous French Char B tanks were technically superior to German Panzers, but they were dispersed in infantry support roles rather than concentrated for armoured counterattack. When French armour did counterattack, particularly at Ston on May 15-17, they inflicted serious casualties on German forces and temporarily stopped advances. But these counterattacks were local and uncoordinated, achieving tactical success without strategic impact. French military capability was adequate. French command system was catastrophically inadequate for mobile warfare's tempo. The German breakthrough wasn't clean exploitation through open country. It was confused fighting against sporadic French resistance traffic jams behind the advancing spearheads and constant worry about exposed flanks. Guderian's panzers drove west toward the English Channel, but they were strung out in narrow corridor with French forces to north and south. German infantry couldn't keep pace with armour, creating gaps in the advance. Supply lines were vulnerable. French or British counterattack against the corridor could have cut off the panzer spearheads from their supplies and reinforcements, potentially trapping them. German High Command was terrified of exactly this scenario and repeatedly ordered halts to allow infantry to catch up and flanks to be secured. Guderian repeatedly ignored these orders or found ways to interpret them creatively, continuing to advance. This created tension, bordering on insubordination between frontline commanders who wanted to exploit and senior commanders who wanted to consolidate. The fact that exploitation succeeded doesn't mean it was inevitable or that German command had unified vision. It succeeded despite internal arguments because French countermoves were even less coordinated than German advances. The Holt Order of May 24th demonstrated continued German command confusion even after breakthrough succeeded. German panzer forces had reached the English Channel, cutting Allied armies in half, and were positioned to complete the encirclement by driving north to capture Dunkirk before British forces could evacuate. Hitler ordered panzers to halt ostensibly to rest and refit before the final push. The reasons for this order are debated: concerns about tank losses, belief that Luftwaffe alone could prevent evacuation, political calculations about preserving armour for the upcoming campaign to conquer southern France. Whatever the reason, the order gave British forces time to establish defensive perimeter around Dunkirk and begin evacuation. Over 300,000 British and French troops escaped troops who would later fight in North Africa, Italy, and Normandy. The Holt Order is considered one of Hitler's major strategic mistakes, but it reflected genuine German concerns about panzer condition after weeks of operations. German armour had suffered mechanical breakdowns, combat losses, and crew exhaustion. The halt was arguably prudent militarily, even though it was disastrous strategically. But the fact that such order was issued demonstrates that German success wasn't effortless or achieved through superior machines. It was achieved through determined aggression despite mechanical and organizational limitations. The mythology of Blitzkrieg as coherent doctrine was created largely post-war, particularly by German generals, writing memoirs in the 1950s. Heinz Guderian published Panzerleader, presenting himself as visionary, who understood armoured warfare and was vindicated at Sedan. Other generals wrote similar accounts, emphasizing planning doctrine and German military superiority while downplaying chaos, luck, and French mistakes. These memoirs became source material for military historians who synthesized them into narrative of Blitzkrieg as German innovation that revolutionized warfare. The reality is that Blitzkrieg wasn't doctrine, it was description applied after the fact to explain German successes. German military planning emphasized aggressive action, combined arms coordination, and exploitation of success, but there was no unified Blitzkrieg doctrine taught at German staff colleges. Different commanders had different approaches. Guderian emphasized speed and deep penetration. Rommel emphasized combined arms and close support. Model emphasized caution and securing flanks. What they shared was aggression and willingness to take risks, not adherence to common doctrine. The role of luck at Sedan cannot be overstated. German forces were lucky that Allied air reconnaissance failed to spot massive concentrations in Ardennes, lucky that French command considered Ardennes impassable and deployed weak forces there, lucky that French counterattacks were uncoordinated and arrived piecemeal, lucky that communication failures plagued French defenders more than German attackers, lucky that bridges over Meuse weren't destroyed before German forces arrived, lucky that traffic jams in Ardennes didn't create insurmountable bottlenecks, lucky that French reserve armour was dispersed rather than concentrated. Every military operation involves luck, but Sedan involved so much luck that German victory was far less inevitable than post-war narratives suggest. If Allied air forces had bombed Ardennes columns effectively, if French reserves had counterattacked quickly in coordination, if French command had processed information faster and made decisions more flexibly, German breakthrough might have failed. The margin between success and failure was smaller than mythology admits. French command failures amplified German success beyond what German capabilities alone could achieve. General Maurice Gamelin, commanding Allied forces, was indecisive and slow to respond to changing situations. French doctrine required centralized control, but Gamelin's headquarters took days to issue orders for situations that required immediate response. When Sedan breakthrough was reported, Gamelin's initial reaction was disbelief, then delayed authorization for counterattacks, then confusion about which reserves to commit where. By the time French forces were ordered to counterattack the breakthrough, German forces had already exploited beyond the planned counterattack's reach. Gamelin was replaced by General Maxime Weygand on May 19th, but Weygand's plan to pinch off the German corridor couldn't be implemented because forces needed for the operation were no longer positioned correctly. French military was defeated as much by its own command paralysis as by German aggression. German commanders like Guderian operated on initiative and aggression, making decisions at tactical level and daring higher command to court-martial them. French commanders waited for orders from above, and those orders arrived too late to matter. The human experience of Sedan for soldiers on both sides was chaos and fear. German infantry crossing the Meuse under fire described it as terrifying, expecting to be killed, surprised when they survived. French soldiers defending positions described being bombed relentlessly, receiving no clear orders, watching their officers flee or freeze, deciding independently to retreat or surrender, because continuing to fight seemed pointless when everyone around them was leaving. Panzer crews described constant breakdowns, running out of fuel, losing track of their units, navigating by compass through unfamiliar territory, expecting counterattacks that never came. Both sides experienced fog of war, where information was incomplete, contradictory, or non-existent. The difference was that German command structure expected chaos and empowered subordinates to make decisions without waiting for orders, while French command structure required centralized control that couldn't function when communications broke down. This difference in command philosophy mattered more than equipment quality or tactical doctrine. The broader strategic context of Sedan reveals that German success created unexpected problems. The rapid exploitation to the channel divided German forces' armor was in narrow corridor driving west, while infantry was still consolidating in Belgium and around Sedan. This created the vulnerable corridor that worried German high command. If Allied forces had understood the situation and coordinated attacks from north and south against the corridor, they might have cut off the Panzer spearheads. But Allied command never achieved the coordination necessary for such operation. British forces were falling back toward Channel ports. French forces were reacting to local threats without coordinated strategic plan. The German gamble that Allied command would be too slow and uncoordinated to exploit German vulnerabilities was proven correct, but it was a gamble, not certainty. Military planning that depends on enemy incompetence is risky, and German operations at Sedan depended critically on French incompetence that German planners couldn't have predicted with confidence. The propaganda element of Blitzkrieg mythology served important purposes for everyone involved. For Germans, it explained victory and reinforced belief in military superiority that would be useful in future campaigns. For French, it explained defeat through German innovation rather than French failure, preserving some dignity in catastrophic loss. For British, it explained why France fell and justified continued resistance. If Blitzkrieg was unstoppable innovation, then French defeat was inevitable, but Britain could develop countermeasures. For post-war military theorists, Blitzkrieg became case study in armoured warfare and combined arms operations demonstrating principles that informed Cold War doctrine. Everyone had reasons to accept and promote Blitzkrieg mythology, and questioning it was inconvenient. Only decades later, when primary sources became available and historians examined events critically, did clearer picture emerge of what actually happened at Sedan versus what people believed happened. The technical reality of German armour in 1940 contradicts mythology of superior technology. German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks were not technically superior to French Char B or Saumur S-35 tanks. French armour was better armoured, often better armed, mechanically reliable. What German armour had was radio communication. Every German tank had radio allowing coordination and flexible tactics. French tanks typically had radios only at company command level, making coordinated action difficult. This communication advantage mattered more than armour thickness or gun calibre. German tactics emphasised combined arms tanks, infantry artillery, and air support working together. French tactics treated tanks as infantry support weapons, dispersing them rather than concentrating them. These doctrinal and organizational factors explain German success more than technical superiority explains it. The myth of German technological superiority served post-war purposes. It explained French defeat through inevitability of superior technology rather than through mistakes that might have been avoided, but it wasn't true. The Luftwaffe's role at Sedan is often overstated in popular accounts. German air support was significant. Stuka dive bombers attacked French positions. Bombers struck rear areas. Fighters provided air cover. But Luftwaffe effectiveness was variable. Many attacks missed targets. Communication between ground and air forces was inadequate. French anti-aircraft fire was effective when French forces weren't panicked. What Luftwaffe achieved was primarily psychological. The sound of Stukas diving the sight of bombers overhead created impression of overwhelming force that contributed to French demoralization. The actual damage inflicted by air attacks was often limited. French positions weren't destroyed by bombing, they were abandoned by defenders who panicked. This psychological effect was real and important, but it's different from narrative that suggests German air power destroyed French defenses through firepower. Psychological warfare is effective warfare, but it's not the technological superiority narrative of Blitzkrieg mythology. The comparison with Germany's later operations reveals that Sedan was exceptional rather than typical. German operations in Soviet Union in 1941 initially succeeded through similar aggressive tactics, but eventually failed when logistics couldn't support deep penetrations, when Soviet forces adapted to mobile warfare, and when distance and weather negated German advantages. The assumption that Blitzkrieg was a replicable formula for success was disproven repeatedly in North Africa, where distance and logistics limited operations in Italy, where terrain negated mobility in Normandy, where Allied air power and firepower prevented exploitation. Sedan worked through specific combination of German aggression, French mistakes, favorable terrain, and luck. Those conditions weren't replicable consistently, and treating Sedan as template rather than anomaly led German command to overestimate capabilities and underestimate opponents. The mythology of Blitzkrieg created dangerous confidence that Germany's tactical excellence could overcome strategic disadvantages. That confidence contributed to decision to invade Soviet Union, to declarations of war on United States, to strategic overreach that ultimately cost Germany the war. The lesson of Sedan, what actually happened versus what mythology claims happened, is that military success is messier, more contingent, and more dependent on enemy mistakes than clean narratives suggest. Wars are won through combination of competence and luck, through exploiting enemy weaknesses faster than enemies exploit yours, through maintaining initiative, even when plans break down. The Wehrmacht at Sedan was competent, but not superhuman. French forces were adequate, but poorly commanded. German success resulted from doing slightly better than French in situation where both sides were improvising. That's not satisfying narrative. It doesn't provide clear lessons or validate theories, but it's accurate. The Blitzkrieg that wasn't the chaos, arguments, traffic jams, lucky breaks, and desperate improvisation that characterized Sedan teaches more about warfare's reality than the mythological Blitzkrieg of post-war narratives. Sedan succeeded despite disorganization, not because German forces transcended disorganization through superior planning. Understanding this distinction matters for understanding military history accurately and for developing realistic assessment of what military forces can actually achieve under combat conditions. The French army in 1940 was not weak or incompetent force that popular narrative suggests. It was large, well-equipped, experienced force with quality equipment and capable soldiers. What it lacked was command system that could operate at modern warfare's tempo and doctrine that emphasized mobility and exploitation. These were correctable deficiencies. If France had survived 1940 and had time to adapt, French forces might have defeated Germany in subsequent campaigns. But France didn't get that time because Sedan breakthrough led to strategic collapse before adaptation was possible. German forces exploited French weaknesses ruthlessly and rapidly enough that French strengths never mattered. This is what aggressive offensive warfare does. It denies enemy time to correct mistakes or leverage advantages. But aggressive offense is risky and requires luck. And German forces at Sedan were lucky enough that their aggression worked before French could respond effectively. That's combat reality. Timing and luck matter as much as planning and capability. The human cost of Sedan and subsequent campaign was substantial. France lost approximately 90,000 killed and 200,000 wounded. Germany lost approximately 27,000 killed and 111,000 wounded. These casualties demonstrate that French forces fought, that German success wasn't bloodless, that both sides paid prices for the campaign. The mythology of Blitzkrieg as effortless conquest erases the soldiers who died, who fought desperately, who held positions until killed or captured. Both French defenders at Sedan and German attackers experienced real combat with real casualties. The difference in outcomes came from operational and strategic levels, not from one side fighting harder than the other. Individual French soldiers often fought with courage and determination. Individual German soldiers often experienced fear and confusion. The mythology that frames Sedan as German superiority versus French inferiority is disrespectful to both. It denies Germans credit for succeeding despite enormous challenges, and it denies French credit for fighting despite impossible situations. The post-war appropriation of Blitzkrieg by military theorists created doctrine around concept that was never doctrine originally. American and Soviet military theorists studied German operations and concluded that combined arms mobile warfare and deep operations were keys to modern success. They weren't wrong. Those elements are important. But they systematized and codified what German forces did largely through improvisation and aggressive application of basic principles. The airland battle doctrine, developed by US Army in 1980s Soviet deep battle theory, Israeli combined arms tactics, all show influence of supposed Blitzkrieg doctrine. But what they're actually copying is post-war mythology about German operations, not what German forces actually did in 1940. The irony is that this mythology-based doctrine is often effective because the principles are sound, even if the historical understanding is flawed. Effective doctrine can emerge from flawed history if the principles being extracted are valid. But it's worth recognizing that Sedan teaches different lessons when understood accurately than it teaches through mythology. The final assessment of Sedan must balance German competence against French failure and recognize role of contingency. German forces at Sedan were aggressive, flexible, and willing to take risks. These are valuable military qualities. French command was rigid, slow, and risk-averse. These are dangerous military deficiencies. The encounter between aggressive competence and rigid incompetence produced the outcome it would be expected to produce. But the margin was narrower than results suggest. Small changes better. French reconnaissance faster. French decision-making more aggressive. French counterattacks might have stopped German breakthrough or trapped German spearheads. The decisive phase of campaign lasted only days. Different decisions in those days might have produced different outcomes. This doesn't mean France would have won. German forces were formidable, and French command problems were systemic. But it means Sedan wasn't an inevitable demonstration of German superiority. It was specific battle fought under specific circumstances, where German forces did slightly better than French forces at exploiting opportunities and avoiding mistakes. That's how battles are won, but it's not the narrative of inexorable German military genius that Blitzkrieg mythology promotes. Sedan, 1940, matters because it changed World War II's trajectory. French defeat led to British evacuation at Dunkirk, German occupation of Western Europe, and strategic situation that shaped everything afterward. Understanding what actually happened at Sedan, the chaos, improvisation, luck, and mistakes, provides better foundation for understanding military history than accepting mythology of perfect Blitzkrieg. The truth is messier and less satisfying, but more instructive. Wars are won by forces that manage chaos slightly better than opponents manage chaos. The Wehrmacht managed chaos slightly better at Sedan And that small advantage created massive strategic consequences. That's the real lesson. Not that German forces were perfectly planned, unstoppable machines, but that they were aggressively competent force, facing rigidly incompetent opponents. And competent aggression defeated incompetent defense. Because timing and initiative matter more than planning perfection. Sedan wasn't the Blitzkrieg that mythology describes. It was the breakthrough that almost wasn't that succeeded through combination of German boldness and French collapse that demonstrated modern warfare's reality better than any doctrine manual. That reality is chaos managed, risks taken, mistakes exploited, and luck acknowledged. That's what really happened at Sedan, and that's worth understanding accurately even if it's less mythologically satisfying than the legend.